Want to know why? Ask how. Howard the Humongous. On Friday, July 25th, Judy Woodruff, one of the most august journalists on the PBS NewsHour, went on camera and reported that the UN had confessed that 2 of its schools have been used to house rockets for Hamas. They had 2 of its schools have been used as munitions depots. Israel claims in the Gaza war between Israel and Hamas that it is attacking civilian targets like schools, including UN schools, and hospitals, because schools, hospitals, and apartment buildings are all being used to store Hamas weapons, and that weapons are firing, that rockets are being fired and mortars are being fired from between Palestinian apartment buildings, deliberately to make sure that if they draw any fire in return, that fire will kill civilians. I mean, remember, for Hamas, which doesn't regard life the way you and I do, it's part of a group, a larger Islamic community of Islamic extremist groups, one of whose slogans is, "We value death more than you value life." Hamas knows it is fighting a propaganda war with Israel. Hamas knows that every time it can show a picture of a Palestinian baby dying, it does the equivalent of 10,000 press releases in the war against Israel. It is a victory. Plus, Hamas believes that that child dies as a shaheed, that that child dies as a martyr, that that child goes immediately to paradise. So the death of a child is not really a problem, though you can see very plainly, and I can see very plainly, that the parents of those babies and children who are dying because they are being used as human shields by Hamas are not happy about the loss of their children at all. They are agonized. They do not agree with Hamas about the loss of their children being one of the most glorious things that can possibly happen to them. Back to Judy Woodruff. Judy Woodruff reported, as I said, that the UN had confessed that 2 of its schools are being used to house Hamas rockets, weapons. In other words, that school children are being used as human shields by Hamas. 10 minutes later, Judy Woodruff hosted what was supposed to be a debate between a pro-Israeli person and a Palestinian-American woman. And the Palestinian-American woman said that the idea that Hamas is using women and children as human shields, the idea that Hamas is using civilians to cloak and protect its weaponry, is not only false, it is merely a talking point from those devious Jews, though she didn't overtly say devious Jews. She simply kept repeating that is a talking point, that is a talking point, it is unproven. Judy Woodruff never called her on that. Judy Woodruff had just reported the news that the UN itself had reported that 2 schools, 2 United Nations schools, were being used to house weapons. Why did Judy Woodruff never call the Palestinian American, who was, you'll have to excuse me for a judgment call here, who was lying? Why did Judy Woodruff never call the lie, even though she had reported on its very antithesis only minutes before? Once upon a time, when the Iranians established a New York office for their propaganda channel, Press TV, it's their English language worldwide propaganda channel. For 2 years, they were after me to be a guest. I didn't want to be a guest. Why? Because Press TV is owned by the Iranian government. As I said, it's a propaganda channel. And the Iranian government wants me dead, me, on 3 different counts. Because I am a Zionist, because I am an atheist, and because I am a Jew. And in any way helping a government that adheres to those basic demands from the world, from this earth, is a government I don't want to support in any way. Meanwhile, a book came out by two academics, Mearsheim and Wald. It was called The Israel Lobby. It fed into an old anti-Semitic idea. The old anti-Semitic idea is that the Jews control two sectors. They control banking and they control the press, the media industry, the newspapers. Both of these are false. And I was furious with the Mearsheim and Wald Israel Lobby book because it played into the hands of the Muslim extremists who are anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. It played into their hands when they claim that the American government is simply a Zionist puppet. That's crazy, absolutely crazy. I was so furious that one day at the Tea Lounge, where I've written 3 of my books, this big cavernous cafe, when I saw somebody reading what is the book called again? The Israel Lobby. When I saw somebody reading The Israel Lobby, I walked up to him and I pounded him with words viciously. And I've never done that before. I mean, it's rude, period. It's not acceptable. And yet I did it. And then Iranian TV, Press TV, called and said, would you be willing to come on to discuss the Israel Lobby? And I said yes, because I needed to vent on this subject somewhere. So I called several friends who are high up in the American pro-Israel group and who are brilliant, 2 friends who are brilliant at research and who know every movement of, for example, of Islamic terrorist groups in the United States, and said, how much money is the Israel Lobby spending per year to lobby the government and for PR? And how much money is the Islam Lobby spending per year? And they said, Islam Lobby? What do you mean, Islam Lobby? And I said, there are 57 nations that identify themselves as Islamic nations. They all belong to a single group of Islamic nations around the world. Every single one of them employs a publicist or a publicity firm and a separate or possibly the same lobbying firm in Washington. That's 57 PR representatives and 57 lobbying firms. If you put all the money together from those 57 nations who disagree about lots of things, but all agree about Israel, all agree about the Palestinians, how much money does it come to? And nobody could tell me. So I had to do the research on my own. Well, frankly, I was only able to find the figure for one of the Arab or Islamic countries, Saudi Arabia. That figure came from the mouth of an Egyptian journalist and novelist. And it came from several other sources as well. It was a figure of $80 billion spent since the establishment of Israel in 1948. So here's how it breaks down. The Israel Lobby spends 1 penny for every man, woman, and child in America every single year on moving headlines and on moving congressmen and senators. How much do you think? Just one of the 57 Muslim nations, Saudi Arabia, spends per year for that kind of influence over headlines and politicians. Have you guessed? It's $12.38. So try walking into a candy store with a penny, and how much can you buy? Absolutely nothing. Try walking into the candy store with $12.38. As Rob McConnell, the host of the X Zone radio show, said a couple of nights ago, you can get a good sugar buzz off of that, a very good sugar buzz. Well, Washington is a candy store, and so is the press. And you buy influence in devious ways. The Saudis have bought influence by purchasing, by funding chairs of Middle Eastern studies at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and all over the country. That means they control what students are taught at these schools all over the country. Once upon a time, in the late 40s and early 1950s, those Middle Eastern studies departments used to have an equal degree of tolerance for the Jews of Israel and the Arabs of the region. Now They are all anti-Israel, all anti the Jews. You buy influence by establishing madrasas, schools, so that you control what kids are taught as they are growing up. And if you're Saudi Arabia, you have a prince, Prince Bandar, who for 25 years is such an integral part of the American White House that he is considered an additional cabinet member for 25 years. When a war breaks out, when Israel is declared in 1948 and 5 Arab nations, all of the 5 surrounding nations, declare at once that they will make war on Israel and drive the Jews into the sea within 24 hours. And when on the radio they beg the Palestinians in that territory, the Arabs in that territory, to leave so that the next day, 24 hours later, they can come back and scoop up the goodies. It's called dividing up the loot. It's the entire subject of the 8th chapter of the Quran, how to divide up the loot after beating the pants off an enemy, killing its males, taking its women and its sexually attractive children as sex slaves. All of that is in the Quran, how to divide these things up. When those 5 nations were about to go on the air and asked the Arabs to leave so that they could mop up the place, so that they could just shove the Jews into the ocean, the military forces of those 5 Arab countries had fresh reconnaissance photos of Israel, its troops, its land, its people. Where did they get these fresh reconnaissance photos? From the secret files of the US Air Force. And how did they get these top secret photos? The Saudis employed a company to build not just all of their oil wells, all of their oil extraction facilities, but also to build buildings, cities. That company made a lot of money. It was called Bechtel. But the deal with Bechtel is, you get our money only if you operate as our representative in the United States. Bechtel had a lot of pull. Bechtel would later have so much pull that almost the entire cabinet of the George Bush Sr. administration would be drawn from Bechtel employees. And Bechtel went to the Air Force, went to the files, where the top secret military reconnaissance photos of that day were kept, had enough pull to be able to yank the photos out of those files and distributed them to the Arab countries. That's influence. And the Saudis have bought that influence with $12.38 spent for every man, woman, and child in America when the Israel lobby spends a penny. When Judy Woodruff goes on the air and reports that the UN admits that 2 of its schools have been used as rocket housing facilities, when she then 10 minutes later acts as if that information never went through her at all, didn't recognize it at all, when Judy Woodruff shows a pro-Palestinian bias, that's money talking. Money talking without bribes. Without bribes. Let's go back to another story. If you get a job in the State Department, you know from the first day you entered the doors that someday you will be wealthy. Why? Because the Saudis are not going to give you a bribe when you're in office. They're not going to overtly buy your opinions and your efforts. But it is known in the State Department that if you have towed the Saudi line throughout your career and you retire 40 years later, when you retire, you will be fabulously rich. Fabulously rich. It is said that one of the Saudi representatives showed up on Colin Powell's doorstep one day after Colin Powell had retired, dangling a set of keys to a fancy, flashy new Jaguar that was sitting out in front of the lawn. Saudi's little gift to him, but that was nothing compared to the money that the Saudis dole out. So the Saudis buy influence in subtle ways. They do the things that they accuse the Jews of doing, that the Jews, in fact, do not do. If you want to find the lobby that is shaping the opinions of Judy Woodruff and many others, that is keeping the truths of the Gaza situation, the one side of the truths. Remember, there are many truths to this. There's the Palestinian truths, and there are the Jewish Zionist truths. I talk to you about the Jewish Zionist truth because those are the truths I know. Other people are very willing to talk to you about the truth as seen by the Palestinians. But when you want to know why you don't see any of these truths from the Zionist side, the Jewish side in the news, when you want to know why 3 people were able to walk into my apartment 15 years ago and tell me, never say that you're a Zionist. It's the equivalent of saying you're a Nazi. One of them was a leader of the Communist Party in the United States. One of them was the person who built a studio for Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! When she was thrown out of her radio station, WBAI in New York. And the third was an Israeli film producer who I love, who's surprisingly very anti-Israeli. When you want to know who's really skewing the news when it comes to the Middle East, start with the Saudis. And if you add up the other 56 nations, Islamic nations, spending money on public relations and on lobbying, I think you'll find a rather surprising figure. Watch out when the news is skewed. Watch for alternative narratives. Watch for alternatives, points of view. This is Howard the Among Us, speaking to you from the future. It is literally your job and my job to make. Or, I forgot this one on the previous one, or, want to know why? Ask how. Now for that sneaky, slimy, devious little off button. Ah! I got it.